Stu, thank you for making the time. Thank you for coming on. Can you give yourself a little bit of an overview of so people can watch this, listen to this, go, oh, this is who Stephen Backhouse is? Like, sum yourself up, maybe not too existentially. Who are you and what are you about?
If you're watching on a video on YouTube, you can see I've got a framed Risk board behind me. I've got some comic books. I've got some Kierkegaard books. Let's see. You can see some books up on about magic. I'm really interested in the culture of magic and mysticism and why people believe that stuff. I've got Karl Barth, Stanley Hauerwas. You can see the kind of person I am, the kind of things I'm interested in. Political books. So I'm a political theologian who loves board gaming and comic books, as well as reading.
You must be a
Charles
nightmare
Williams.
at dinner tables. You know, you're not supposed to talk about religion or politics. And so what do you do? Well, I'm a political theologian.
Yeah. So I'm a Canadian. I moved here. I moved to England. I live in England right now, but I moved to England when I was 19. So now I've been in England for 24 years now. And I grew up in a very conservative cultural part of Canada, which really associated its Christianity with its patriotism. And I grew up in a little village or a real town of self-described fundamentalists, and where everybody was a Christian. And then I moved to England, and it sort of blew my tiny little mind, because I couldn't associate being a Christian with being a conservative right-wing Canadian anymore. Bible Belt kind of thing. And then, so that opened me up. It got me really thinking. I discovered Kierkegaard, who helped me to use language about Christendom and Christianity. And then when I decided to go to university, I went to university in England, and I decided to study philosophy and theology so I could study more Kierkegaard. And then that led me to becoming a political theologian, because I used Kierkegaard to look at nationalism and national identity and Christianity. And that led me into looking at politics and political theology. And now I've been doing that for the last 20 years or so, mainly about patriotism and religion and Christianity. So completely irrelevant to today. There's no Christians today.
That doesn't happen anywhere, does it?
Nobody confuses their patriotism with their Christianity in this world anymore. And I also run a little thing called Tent Theology, which is I used to, before lockdown, I was a traveling theologian. I would go, churches or networks or groups would hire me to come and be their resident theologian for a time. So I would live with them for a weekend or a week and help set up spaces for thinking Christianly about your own Christianity without having to go to university to do it. And that was great fun. And I still do it, but lockdown meant that a lot of it's gone online. So I run high-level Bible studies or theology groups or discussion groups for different churches. I have regular relationships with churches all around the place now. And Canada, Northern Ireland, America, UK. And then part of lockdown meant that I also started a Tent Theology podcast, because it was my way of staying in touch with my colleagues and my friends, and to still keep my foot in the door, as it were. So that's what I do. I'm sort of a freelance roving theologian who sometimes does. Oh yeah, the other thing I do, Phil, is sometimes, because I'm a political theologian, what I love is finding ways to do kingdom outside of church, because I don't like churches very much, really. I like my churches that I work with, but I don't like the church as an institution. I think it's done a demonstrably bad job of raising up disciples of Jesus. And so I like looking for things the kingdom outside of church. And I ended up doing a lot of political theology with businesses or organizations, and I help charities or startup businesses think Christianly about what they're doing and how they organize themselves, how they use their power. That's a lot of fun, to be some sort of theological management consultant.
That sounds amazing. I love it. I love it. That sounds like a dream come true to a lot of people, I'm sure. And
it's nice not to mark essays anymore, not to be an academic and mark.
There you go.
That's worth it.
I'm fascinated. So as you're talking about that, right, I'm thinking a lot of people, you're not going to struggle to find people that are nodding their head along to what you're saying, as far as the audience of this show. People generally done with institutionalized the church, this empire that has become the face of Christianity. But as you're going and as you're describing, you use the term kind of like Christianly, like something that I presume you mean reflects Christ. I mean, but do you think that is something that is largely divorced from the institution at this point? And how would you describe this goal of something that is Christianly?
Well, I don't even know if I like that. I don't like that word very much.
Okay.
If you listen to, within the first 3 episodes of my Tent Theology podcast, which by the way is specifically about renewing the social and political imagination. So within the first few episodes, essentially we just say, fine, the word Christian, it's not that useful anymore, or it doesn't really mean what we want it to mean. It's so broad it can mean anything you want. I'm not going to die on that hill. I'm not a Christian. That's fine. But you can call yourself a Christian and believe and do all sorts of things. It's harder to say you're a follower of the way of Jesus than say and do all sorts of things. So I like that more.
Okay. Yeah.
So when I say Christianly, our language isn't very good, so it's not very useful. That word is diluted now. But what I guess what I mean is people whose imaginations are governed by the way of Jesus. That's what I'm interested in. So people who want to deal with others in a way that's informed by the way Jesus did, people who want to do their politics or their money or their violence or their church in a Christ-informed way, a Christian imagination way. And that, obviously, no surprise to you, a lot of people who call themselves Christian, in fact, don't like Jesus very much. They don't like his way. They don't like his words. They don't like trying to organize themselves and use their power the way he said to do it. And so I don't think they might be Christian. I'm not in the game of saying who's a Christian or not. I'm like, fine, you're a Christian. Donald Trump, he's a Christian. Fine. Of course he is. According to almost any sociological, historical, statistical survey, he's a Christian. Is he following the way of Jesus? Oh, no. So I'm more interested in that. I'm way more interested in that than the word Christian. I'm not going to die on the hill of deciding who's a Christian and who's not.
Yeah. No, I think I often say, these concepts, so we're so quick to label things and need things to be labeled, but generally speaking, labels don't particularly help us at all, generally speaking. Someone that knows us well already knows who we are, doesn't need a label. Someone that doesn't know us, as soon as they have a label, they're not going to get to know us, and they're going to probably categorize us based on what they think that label means. That's a good point. So with something like the way of Jesus, though, I mean, even that, you could sit down with, Fred Phelps is dead now, but you could have sat down with Fred Phelps, you could sit down with Bill Johnson, with John Piper, with Bart Ehrman. I mean, you could pick a lot of people that have dedicated their lives to following in at least as far as they would confess, they would say, I am trying to follow the way of Jesus, and maybe someone like Bill Johnson is going to, by doing healing, I'm trying to heal people and be in the presence of God, and that's following the way of Jesus. But then he might vote very differently than someone like, I don't know, John Piper. I don't know how John Piper voted. He just wrote a pretty good article actually about his stuff. Yeah. But but John Piper, what is the way of Jesus for John Piper? He's got this quite a kind of neo-Calvinistic kind of blend. That a lot of the components of that you go, it doesn't feel very in line with Christ. No, but Phil, this is all
you're just talking religion though. Like you're just talking competing.
But these people would be very quick to say, no, I'm following the way of Jesus, and so.
Yeah,
what do you?
I'm not pretending to solve all the problems.
How do you define that though? So for yourself, when you go, no, I'm following, or I'm as I perceive the way of Jesus, like what does that look like for you? What are the key components that you kind of take off and go, okay, this person's on the path of Jesus?
The main one is violence. The main one is killing people. Do you think killing a human being to solve a problem is a valid response for the way of Jesus? And if you say yes, you're like, all right. Show me. It's not rocket science. We have limited data. It's not like Jesus wrote and said a whole lot of mysterious things. It's all there. You can read it in one sitting.
Yeah.
There's 4 gospels. Find me where killing a human being, killing your enemies is part of the way of Jesus. Oh, but what about just war? Oh, but what about, you're like, yeah, I'm not saying give me good arguments for killing human beings. I'm saying show me whether Jesus did that.
Yeah.
So I would say the same with going for healing. I'm like, cool. That's the way of Jesus. All right, let's do it. And I'm not even saying it's going to win the argument. I'm not saying it works. This is what always happens. Oh, but that's really impractical. It wouldn't work. I'm like, I'm not talking about whether it works. We're just saying, is it the way of Jesus or not? That's all we're saying. And so if I follow the way of Jesus and I fail, oh, well, that's not, we haven't had a discussion about whether it is the way of Jesus or not. We've just had a discussion about whether it worked.
That was not the response to Jesus. Oh, this is a really practical output. Great. This will work really well.
So if you wanted to have a chat with John Piper or something about this, and he starts talking about neo-reformed Calvinism, I'm like, yeah, I didn't ask you about how well you're following Calvin. I'm asking you, when you have power, do you use it the way Jesus used it? When you have money, do you use it the way he asked you to do it? When you meet a foreigner, do you treat them the way he did? Then if you can say yes, I'm like, all right, cool. Let's keep going. It's not that complicated. We've overcomplicated it. Way overcomplicated it. Our moral compass is spinning wildly, and we have this all the time. I run across this constantly. Well, you just mentioned Bill Johnson or whatever. Like, so Bill Johnson, whenever he uses his public platform to promote politics, it's always promoting a politics and people who are like 100% against the way of Jesus. Oh, but Bill's such a nice guy. I didn't say he wasn't a nice guy. I'm saying that his politics have not been informed by the way of Jesus. Oh, but he's such a good Bible teacher. I'm like, no. Well, first of all, probably not. If this is where he's at. But secondly, we're not talking about whether he's a Christian or not. We're not talking about that. We're talking about when it comes to these areas of life, is his imagination informed by what Jesus did? And if it's not, then it's not. And he might still be a Christian. Like, so we're not having that argument, right? That's not what I'm trying to do. I'm not trying to say Bill Johnson's not a Christian. I'm saying Bill Johnson is a Christian who, in key areas of his life, he does not follow the way of Jesus.
Yeah.
I
mean, it seems, for me, it's always been, I remember having a conversation with my mum when I was really, really, really young, about this topic of violence, of like, what would you do if, I can't remember, I said, what would you do if someone came in the room with a gun or something and tried to shoot us or whatever? And my mom, I remember my mom saying, well, it's like, Jesus would obviously not want us to respond the same way. He wouldn't want us to shoot that person. He wouldn't want us to try and get the gun off him and kill him or harm him. She said, I would try and save my family. I would try and get between me and my family and this gun. I would speak to this person. I'd love them. She was very Christian. I'd pray for them. I'd offer them salvation, or, they obviously are hurt if they're wanting to hurt someone. And I remember as a kid wrestling with this, because it's so counterintuitive. That's the problem of the gospel, right? It's counterintuitive. And it feels like, generally speaking, we want the gospel to kind of line up with how the world works. Now, you can argue whether the world is working.
Instant, well, like, of course. Look, if you wonder about violence, you can talk about violence for 2 hours. I mean, but it's just constantly, anybody like me who thinks nonviolence is pretty self-evidently the way of Jesus will instantly be met with all these scenarios. But what about if somebody did this? I'm like, so?
Yeah.
We're not, I don't follow the way of Jesus because it works. I followed it because he asked me to.
Well, the early church wasn't famous. The early church wasn't famous for all the apostles amazingly talking down crowds of people that want to kill them, or amazingly, subverting some sort of violent situation. No, they all got martyred, right? So it clearly doesn't, quote unquote, work, right? You end up dead if you really follow this through a lot of the time.
But it did work. It's the
2,000 years ago. But it does work because it rapidly changes everything.
Yeah, but it's the most well-known, long-standing human or movement the world history has ever known. It works.
Do you think though, as far as a long-standing human movement, I mean, we talked about this a little bit in the preamble before we started, what Christianity today feels very, or is for the majority, for the kind of conventional masses, it feels very disconnected from what we're talking about as far as an ethic that is divorced from a punitive justice system, a violent justice system.
Well, this is where my main point. So I said I did my doctorate on Christian nationalism, and I really do think ground zero for all of this stuff is nationalism. And what I mean by that, or even just good old-fashioned patriotism, like what I mean by that is we have the vast majority of Christians in the world now and in history have thought that their Christianity was the same as running a country, or that one of the goals of being a Christian was to to be in charge of the nation. And so we've equated the good of the nation with, we've judged how good our Christianity is by how well it serves our nation. And that is the root of all the things you've just described. So punitiveness, violence, Christians getting involved in all the sorts of social care programs and things. All this stuff is just, some of it is good, some of it is bad, but all of it is Christians thinking that them being followers of Jesus makes them better citizens. And I think that's self-evidently not true. And also it's not the point. Like, it wasn't the point for the New Testament. It wasn't the point for the earliest Christians. And being a good pliant member of your home culture is like the opposite of what being a follower of Jesus meant to the earliest Christians. And so now for a lot of people, it means the opposite. And now the argument you always face, if you want to follow the way of Jesus when it comes to the way you treat foreigners, what you do with your money, or what you do with your violence, immediately the instant response is basically like, you can't run a country that way. I'm like, yeah, I know you can't. That says more about countries than it does about Jesus.
Yeah,
you can't
that's
run
why
a country
the apostles
according to
didn't
Jesus.
set up a country.
And as soon as they started doing it, as soon as they got the Christians got their grubby little fingers on the buttons of power, this is why we have the problems we have now. We've invented cultural Christian is our own problem. The idea of cultural Christianity, or the difference between being an authentic Christian and being a member of Christendom and all that stuff. It's just totally invented by Christians when they started running the culture and assuming being a Christian was the same as being born. Yeah. That's it. That's the problem.
So, I mean, it sounds to me like a lot of what you're pointing to here is the kind of the problem of the issue of power, really. People in these kind of huge positions of power, the idea that power corrupts, absolutely, almost. Is it possible to be in these positions of power and be a good quote unquote Christian, or a follower of the way? Maybe we might be better saying.
Some not. Some. A lot of followers of, or a lot of Christians have to get used to the idea that being a follower of Jesus might make you worse at some jobs, rather than better. And there might be some job. I think, to be honest, I just think any job that requires you to kill a human being is just off the table.
Yeah, you're not going to be a good soldier.
If your job requires you to kill a human being to solve a problem, that's off the table. You can't for followers of Jesus. And there might be a million good arguments of why you should kill that unborn baby, or why you should kill that enemy who's about to bomb you. Million good arguments for all these things. I'm not saying there aren't. I'm just saying that's not the way of Jesus.
Yeah.
So stop calling yourself a Christian. You might be a lot of other things good for the world. We're not having that argument. It's just, there's no way that any of the earliest followers of Jesus would think killing a human being to solve a problem was an option for them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which means
some jobs are off the table for you.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean,
right?
There's certainly different jobs that I'm not going to line up for with my personal Christian or ethic that is very closely tied to Jesus.
But there's some jobs, but nobody has ever existed in a world without some sort of ambiguity, or, I mean, they all knew it. Like even the earliest Christians, when they said, yeah, pay your taxes to Caesar, like they knew that was going to a bad place. Like they weren't pretending that Caesar was this upright, righteous guy. They knew that the money was going to bad things, but so they weren't living this kind of utopia of uncorruption from the world. They said, right, we'll do this because it'll lead to peace. We'll keep our heads down, keep things ticking over, give the bare minimum we can, prove that we're not trying to violently overthrow the government through some organized tax revolt and riot. That's what that is in Romans 13, for example. It's just Paul saying, look, don't raise up arms against your own government. That's not what we're trying to do. Get on with it. We got other things to worry about. And so it is possible to be involved in the world, even if you know, like it's possible to be a tax collector or a policeman or something, and you know that other parts of your institution are doing bad things. I'm not saying like no Christian can ever be involved in anything. It's just the closer you are to having to it being your job to kill a human being, the the less likely it is that you're going to be able to do that as a follower of Jesus.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Talk to me about, because you know your church history much better than I am sure. I hope so, because you wrote a book on the church, the history of the church, right? Kind of an overview of the history of church. I'm intrigued because I've looked at this a little bit, and it feels like there's a lot of people with a lot of different opinions on this, and there's little fragments here or there that certainly in the early church fathers go, oh look, this is an excuse. You know, no, this is qualification for there was an allowance for violence or this or that, and then other people jump on certain passages and go, look, clearly like you couldn't even serve in the military and be a Christian and I'm not entirely I'm not an expert in my church history. I'm certainly not an expert as far as ancient texts and going into the depths of them, but it feels at some point something's changed, right? Because that's not the way we are now, and it doesn't feel like that's been the way of the general Christian movement for a very long time. We don't have to go.
Yeah, ever since they were in charge, right? Ever since they were responsible for the smooth running of their countries and their organizations, that's when Christians thought that violence was justified. That's when. That's why I say nationalism is the ground zero for all this stuff. Because if the Christians didn't think it was their job to run the country, if they didn't have responsibility for it, they wouldn't have thought it was valid to kill another person just because they don't look like you or sound like you. And so we do actually have some evidence of Roman soldiers that were converted to Christianity, and it's fun. It's ironic because you have like the pro-violency type people. They go, look, see, there were Christians in the Roman army, so it must be okay. Well, I have two responses. One is, no, that just shows me that the rot started a lot earlier than like that. All you've done is you've proved that that were disobeying the way of Jesus. You haven't proved that that's not the way of Jesus. Right. But the other thing is, actually go and read that stuff a little bit more. What you'll find is there's letters from like a Roman captain writing to another Roman captain or to his governor. And he's complaining. He's actually complaining. He said, we've got followers of Christ in our camps, amongst our soldiers now, and they're refusing to obey the orders.
Wow.
What do I do with them? So even at that moment, you had Roman soldiers who had converted to the way of Christ, and they were refusing to act like the good soldiers that they should be. And so the captains had to, get them peeling potatoes or whatever it was. Like, yeah, sure. There were soldiers in the army, but they were refusing to kill their enemies. So you tell me whether that's evidence of Christians justified in killing their enemies or not. It looks a lot more like what I'm trying to talk about, which is followers of Jesus are going to be a fly in the ointment everywhere they get. Yeah. They don't make the system run smoothly. They are a problem to the system.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's, I guess the audience that listen to this, in many regards, not all, certainly, but in a huge amount, the reason that they became flies in the ointment of Christianity. They have been isolated, kicked out of their church, rejected by friends, rejected by family, whatever it might be. And many of them, they weren't serious about their faith, or they just backslid, or whatever the language is. Now, some people choose not to follow the path of Jesus anymore, and that's their choice. But actually, a good portion of them would argue that the reason that this all kicked off was because they did choose to follow the way of Jesus. That
just happens all the time. They start to take Jesus more seriously. I'm sure you've had this. I've had this with the Bible as well. Like, amongst the people who like to shout and talk about how much they value the authority of Scripture, as soon as I started taking the Bible seriously, as soon as I gave up some of those inerrant and fundamentalist views, now the Bible is way more authoritative in my life than it ever was when I was a fundamentalist. And that's sorry. And likewise, I always meet people who, I'm losing my faith, I'm having a crisis of faith, and then you find out that obviously what it is they just don't like evangelicals anymore, or they just realize that their church culture has nothing more to offer them. So I often ask people, so do you like, well, because you know that the word faith, right, means pistis, means following the way of Jesus. It doesn't mean mental assent to a series of propositions. So you often find somebody will say, I can't hold to this or that teaching or this or that culture anymore. And I go, okay, so what do you think about Jesus? I still think he's the best person I've ever met. well, you don't have a crisis of faith then.
Yeah.
Right. Now, if you said, what do you think about Jesus? And they go, I just don't like Jesus anymore. I go, okay, now you do have a crisis of faith. Okay. Which is fine. And let's be honest, but a lot of people don't have a crisis of faith. They just don't like evangelicals anymore. Yeah. So well done. You have a moral compass that's in working order. Congratulations.
Yeah. It feels like, I mean, when you look at Jesus seems to be coming to the people of Israel, and this is going to be a very caricature description of what Jesus is doing, but comes to the people of Israel who are very patriotic, very nationalistic. Their concepts of Messiah are all interwoven with nationalism and all that. Comes to them and says, hey, God is not the way you think that God is. God is love. God is kindness. God turns the other cheek. God wants us to forgive. God wants us to love our enemies, not destroy our enemies. God wants us to live in peace with other nations, not rule over them. If he has given us any power, it's so that we can bring other nations up, not lord over them. This kind of narrative, I mean, this is where, after his first message where he preaches from Isaiah, they want to kill him, right? Just because he's like, let's not kill the Romans, and let's love everyone. So you've got these kind of, and it feels like Jesus is trying to like undo this concept of nationalism, and then if we drew a line in the sand, 0 AD or wherever Jesus is, and then we start moving the other way, it seems like it goes right back into what Jesus was trying to bring the Jews out of. It feels like we're coming back in, and it gets to the point where it feels, I mean, these people that talk about their faith crises and deconstructions, becoming nomads, becoming church refugees, all these different languages that we use, it feels like they are genuinely, I mean, if you look at that pistis, this trust, this ability to trust in Jesus, or allow Jesus to trust in us, maybe, it feels like the issue is not with Jesus, but the issue is with God, who has no longer, if Jesus was trying to create this divide between what Jesus looks like and what God looks like and draw that right down, it feels like it's completely separated again. And people's crisis is they can't see a God in the church that looks anything like Jesus.
Of course. Right.
Is that a fair kind of summary of like the church today? Because I feel like the issue for people, like you said, they don't have a problem with Jesus. They're like, Jesus is a pretty sweet guy. I like his ethics, like his teaching. They maybe even have like a quote unquote personal relationship with Jesus. They talk with Jesus, pray with Jesus. The big guy though, little bit more sketchy, a little bit more cagey with the Father, because Father seems to have kind of drifted further away theologically from what Jesus is like.
Well, part of the way of Jesus, by the way, is that he also basically said, I'm God. He's like, I mean, again, sometimes he actually did. So in some of the Gospels, just say, I am God, or I am the Father. But other times he says things like, every time he heals somebody, he's doing something that only belonged in the temple, that only belonged to God. He redefines family around him. He redefines national identity around him. He redefines the law around him. Like, he makes, it was not hidden to the original readers of the Gospels what was happening. And just because we think of Jesus as some nice, good teacher, that's, nobody in the Gospels thought he was a nice, good teacher. You don't kill nice, good teachers, right? You kill people who think that they're God, or that you wish they were their nationalist folk heroes who were going to redeem the nation in some orgy of nationalist bloodletting, Braveheart types. And then you cheer on that person and you say, here comes King David, he's going to kill the Romans for us. And then that guy storms the temple in order to let the foreigners in. This will be a house of prayer for all nations. And then you realize, oh shit, this guy isn't the nationalist hero that we think he is. Oh, and he's now also redefining reality around him, and he's forgiving sins, and he's doing all these things. We got to kill this guy. That's why they kill him. So that has always been the battle. And that was the battle in the New Testament, of that they don't like the God. He says, I'm God, and this is what God looks like. And they don't like either of those things. And then you see this is the energy the New Testament spends. A lot of it is the other letters are trying to, in a way, reform people's imaginations around Jesus and away from their Gentile or their Jewish imaginations and identities. So there's that reforming of your imagination to be a new people, a royal priesthood. That's the whole thrust of the New Testament. So it just shows you that these ideas of tribal identity or national allegiance, the allegiance to the culture you were born into, it's been the most powerful rival to the gospel since year zero.
Yeah.
And that is the most powerful rival to the gospels in the gospels themselves and in Paul's letters, is that alternative allegiance to the home culture you were born into. That is the main. If you look at the New Testament, look at all the times that like people rise up to kill Jesus, or people rise up to kill Stephen, or they howl at Paul. You just got to pay attention how often the New Testament points out that it's at the time when inevitably it'll be somebody's talking about how God loves Jews and Gentiles. And that's when they rise up and they cover their ears. Or when Jesus will say, you're the sons of, you think you're the sons of you Pharisees think you're the son of Abraham, but you're the child of the devil. And they rise up to kill him. That's he's insulting their national identity. That's what happens all the time. It's the national identity that gets everybody wanting to kill Jesus. And so now today I just think, well, it's no different, is it?
Yeah.
The national identity is the rival. In fact, it's way stronger. This is the other thing, is it's way more powerful. Patriotism is the most powerful force in the world. It's way more powerful than the gospel. It doesn't mean it's true or better. It just means it's more powerful.
What do you think's made that more of a force today than it was then? Like globalization kind of components, or?
Well, I think in terms of the Christian imagination, the Christian empires. So the idea of national domination totally won. And now it's not only has it won the argument, it's now using Christian language to justify itself. So like not only did it beat down the idea that following Jesus means it's an alternative politics. Not only did it destroy that feeling in a lot of people, it then baptized its language with using Christian language. Really powerful stuff. So it's very hard to disentangle yourself from it.
Yeah.
And so there's a whole lot of nations out there that still think of themselves. A lot of Christians think of themselves as living in Christian nations, or that they once did, or they will once again. A lot of people who don't even call themselves followers of Jesus would totally think of themselves as living in some sort of post-Christendom or Christian society. And it never was. It was never Christian. So there's centuries of what would I say? Mutual lying to each other.
Believing a fairy tale.
Yeah, it's very strong. It hasn't been now the alternative voice hasn't disappeared. It's always been a minority voice.
Yeah.
But it hasn't disappeared, because one of the things Christendom had to do is it smuggled in the agent of its own demise, a little ticking time bomb, which is the New Testament. I mean, Christendom always has to have the New Testament in some way or other. And that New Testament always contains an image of something totally different than what Christendom produced. And so every age of Christendom will always have its people who discover the New Testament and go, wait a second, this isn't what this book does not reflect what we've got right now. So, yeah.
I mean, it's interesting that you mentioned that. I read, it was probably quite a few months ago now, I read some of Stuart Murray's work. He's a researcher that looks at, and he does some fascinating work looking at Christendom and post-Christendom kind of effects on mostly Europe is probably the most kind of centralized post-Christendom kind of region. Right. And his conversation on this, and he comes probably from a more kind of not knowing him, but from reading his stuff, more of a conventional Christianity as far as he sees it. But he sees it as quite an opportunity for Christians, where he talks about for a long time, Christians have portrayed a gospel to a people that already think they understand it. But what they think they understand is the wrong thing, right? So, I already know, the cross. The cross is just God punishes Jesus so he doesn't have to punish me. And they don't like that fairy tale, right? They don't like that mythology around the cross. And his point is, suddenly you talk to kids in school in Sweden and you tell them the story of Noah's Ark and they're like, what the hell is this? I've never heard of this before. Like, growing up, everyone had heard of Noah's Ark, Christian or not, right? But you move forward 20, 30, 40 years and suddenly less and less and less people are understanding the
Yeah,
framing myths around these kind of initial myths, because these myths evolve and shape and change, and we look at things like something like the clearing out of the temple, which is a radical anti-violence, anti-sacrifice, anti-God is this thing. It turns around on its head, and for much of Christianity, it becomes the linchpin of the argument that no, Jesus is violent, see, and God can be violent,
right?
And there's almost this component of, as people become more and more removed from it, because I do think that people that have this more honest is maybe wrong, and authentic, these are such loaded terms, but people that see the gospel maybe the way that that you do, maybe the way that I do, presuming we see them the same way. I don't know that we do, but in a way of nonviolence, all these different things. There's a real problem presenting that to another Christian, because they will see us twisting the narrative. They will go, you're because they're set in stone. You know, they only can see what they can see.
Classically, a friend of mine, she posts on Facebook, "Want to loose the bonds of the oppressed and set the captive free," and she just quotes Jesus, and then underneath is some Christian guy going, "Oh, it's cultural Marxism," right? This is what we have. This is Christendom now. Right. It's like loads of people walking around who call themselves Christian, would get angry and violent if you told them that they weren't, and yet they do not recognize the voice of Jesus when they see it. Yeah. This happens all the time, and it happens amongst all the celebrity evangelicals and charismatics you mentioned earlier on as well. Like, it's not just the fringe people. Like, it happens... The actual public spokespeople for Christianity do not like or recognize Jesus when he shows up in a room. And it doesn't matter with the tears are glistening on their cheeks after they've been singing a Sean Foyt worship song. It doesn't matter. They don't like or know the way of Jesus. And that's what a lot of what we're doing here. And I'm doing this like person by person, because I don't think there's going to be some mass conversion. I don't think that's the case. And I don't think Christianity or the way of Jesus works very well as a majority rule. It never has been a majority rule. More people who saw Jesus, even according to the Gospels themselves. The Gospels are a very biased set of documents, by the way. Like, they are intended to convince you that Jesus is the Son of God. Yeah. They're very biased. And even those Gospels don't hide the fact that most people who met Jesus hated him or tried to kill him. Most people. So that following Jesus, he's not some knockdown, winning at all costs kind of person. Yeah. And one of the first things you learn about Jesus, if Jesus is God or in any way a representation of God, is you can say no to him. You can kill him. And so the kind of Christianity that we meet today, which is all about domination and winning the culture war or winning the argument or having rights represented in court or whatever, it's all about just wanting to win the space they're in. Yeah. And I just like, well, that's not even that. Jesus doesn't do that. Jesus didn't try and win the spaces he was in. So I don't either. But what you do is you offer things gently to people. So I don't know if you like Bonhoeffer very much, but Bonhoeffer famously says the gospel is weak. It'll lose any argument. It's so weak you can nail it to a cross. The point of presenting the gospel to people is not to beat them down in some argument. It's to just say, here it is. What do you think? Do you want it or not? And if they say no, you say okay. But so I'm not trying to win arguments anymore. I just say, well, here's what these words would have felt like to the first people who hear them. Here's the way of Jesus. What do you think? Do you like it? Yeah. And they go, oh, you can't run a country that way. Or, oh, you sound like a liberal. Or, oh, you sound like to some people, I sound like a conservative. Like, okay, I guess you're right. I guess I do. I guess I don't fit on your spectrum. But yeah. So I don't even know if I don't even try and win arguments anymore. There's just no point. There's just no point.
Yeah. It's interesting as you say that, you know, I am a deep skeptic and I'm very negative, but there's a deep desire within me to want to be a bit more optimistic and positive, and I think it can be quite easy to be negative in this culture.
But, for sure.
You know, looking across the board, you know, whilst we can look at certain things and go, gosh, we've never been more divisive, we've never been more nationalistic, we've never been any more of these things. There's almost an inverse truth as well, and maybe this is the nature of our dualism in this world today, that if we were to look across the broad spread of certainly much of the West and very developed nations, maybe even more so as we focus on Europe and maybe take a step out of America, it feels like the way of Jesus, the ethics of Jesus, you know, loving your neighbor, looking at restorative justice practices instead of punitive justice, things like that, are actually becoming very popular, maybe not even within the Christian circles, maybe actually more so not in the Christian circles. But
this is what I mean by having a moral compass that's in working order, because my measure of good or bad is not whether somebody calls themselves a Christian or not. And this is partly what I was meaning before, is like some kind old duffer like Bill Johnson will say something and people go, oh, he's such a good man, he's such a good Christian, so therefore he must be. Or somebody awful like Donald Trump will do something and then some people are like, oh, but he's a Christian, or he's a baby Christian. I just saw that argument. And so for them, that's the end of the story. As soon as you can identify somebody as a Christian, you're like, all right, fine, that's the end of the story. Whereas I'm like, well, no, calling yourself a Christian is not the same as having a moral compass set towards the source of all goodness. And so I want to be in a position where I recognize goodness when I see it, and I recognize goodness based on whether it's the way of Jesus or not.
Yeah.
And which is why, you know, I can support 99% of Black Lives Matter movement, for example, or whatever it is, because I'm like, I don't care that you call yourself a Marxist atheist. That doesn't bother me. Are you standing with the oppressed? Are you, see, you know, and if you are, then that's goodness, and I'm with that. Yeah. Do you think you should kill now? You know, if I meet a BLM who says I want to kill my enemies, I'm like, well, I know I'm not with you there. But
sure.
So I'm not just sort of throwing my hat in with everybody, but my moral compass is attuned, hopefully, to the way of Jesus, not to some tribal affiliation of Christian or Democrat or socialist or Republican or whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you think, I mean, so just looking at the data, I mean, some of this data is a bit old. It's about 5 years old now because we're still waiting for Pew Research's latest. I think next year is their next religious landscape data. But as of 2014 through to 2019, 2,700 people left the American church, period. Like to never go back every day. 2,700 people every day leaving the American church, never to go back, saying, I'm done. And yet about 79% of them say, I still profess to have some form of spirituality and faith. Yeah. Then I look at that sort of stuff and I look at these people coming out, most of them coming out because of stuff like this. The number one cited thing recently in a study was that the evangelical support of Trump was the number one thing cited as to why people left the church and left their faith. True. Now, a lot of these people still then move forward. And in fact, it's this ethic that pulls them towards Jesus, this loving of enemies, this siding with the afflicted. That's, you know, they're crying out for, oh, look at these people in cages, look at, you know, Black Lives Matter, whatever it is that there's an oppressed. And it feels like...
Problem is they've also been introduced to a form, they think they're no longer, they think they don't follow Jesus anymore. This is the... Yeah. This is why I look at nationalism and I think it's not just wrong-headed, it's evil. Like it's anti-Christ-like, right? To adopt the language of our charismatic brethren. I mean, it is something of the anti-Christ when you can use the language of Christ to stand for the exact opposite of him, so that when people reject that, they think they've rejected Jesus Christ. Yeah. Like that's about as corrupt and evil as you can get. I think American evangelicalism is one of the worst forms of, Christianity that history has ever known, because it has so dominated the culture. It's so dominated people's imagination. It's so dominated the conversation. It has such a wide reach that when people reject Christianity, when they look at American nationalist evangelicalism and they reject that, they think they've rejected Jesus Christ. Yeah. Like, how evil is that? And so, this is where you meet people all the time. They think they've rejected Jesus and they think they're atheists or whatever. And well, they probably are, but it's just because they've never, ever met Jesus. That's why I say it's like, you haven't lost your faith. You never had it. You never were introduced to Jesus in all his glory. You were never introduced to Jesus. So you didn't, how can you lose something you never had?
Yeah. Well, I often even say some people will crucify me over this, not literally, quite almost. I have often helped Christians become atheists because it was a healthy, progressive growth for them. To be honest with you, if we're going to tear it apart and use this language, they were moving towards the way of Christ. Following the path of Jesus. And to do that, for them, they literally had to become an atheist. And maybe further down the line, maybe they become something different, evolves, grows, whatever. But for them, the presentation of Jesus, God's Christianity was so abhorrent, it had to be utterly, baby with bathwater. Maybe we'll come back later for the baby, but right now, it's just got to go.
If your family is abusing you, if you live in a toxic environment and everybody's abusing you, then you got to get out. Even if in theory families are good things, like, well, okay, maybe in theory families are good things, but in practice this family right now for me is killing me, so you have to get out, right? And I can totally see that. And because I don't believe in like eternal damnation for people who don't use the right word order when describing their position towards God and the Trinity, it's like, fine, you're one of the 90, you're the one sheep. Jesus is with you.
Yeah.
I'm not worried about it. It's not my job to save your soul. And I don't think your soul is in eternal damnation anyway. So that's all. I
guess that's what I was going to ask was how do you perceive, and whatever our theology of a person of Jesus sort of sitting up in the skies watching us or within us or whatever, but do you see Jesus looking on at what's happening in the world right now as far as the fastest growing spiritual movement in the world right now is people leaving religion that claim to have spirituality? That's the fastest growing movement. It's growing faster than Islam, than any form of Christianity, is people going, I'm done with those things, but I still have some sort of spirituality. Do you think if Jesus was kind of looking on at that and the general theme of what those people are like and what they stand for and why they're leaving religion, and maybe this isn't your expertise, but I look at that and I go, gosh, this is actually quite exciting to me. I get a little bit pumped about it. I'm pretty excited. That's why I've dedicated my life to doing this. But do you look at that and go, gosh, but they need to know Jesus as a personal savior. They need to have that language. They need to have these kind of. But it sounds like you're not too invested in that if they're moving the way of Jesus into and creating the way of Jesus as a way within this world.
Yeah, but if they are, I do genuinely think the way of Jesus is the way humans work best. I mean, I do think it is the way of salvation. I just don't think salvation necessarily means I don't think it means a place you go to when you die. Like, broad is the way that leads to destruction and narrow is the way that leads to life. I don't think that's a description of when you die, your soul is going to go to destruction or to life. And only if you've said a few words in the right order will you get to life. I think he's saying, look around you. What things in life right now are leading to destruction? People are chasing after lethal violence. By the way, when I talk about violence, I mean lethal violence. I think turning over tables is violence. It's not killing a human being. So lethal violence, absolute greed, wild. I just think of all the stuff that is leading to violence or to destruction right now in this world. Pride, lust, greed, all the things that Jesus says, control yourself. Don't do these things. Narrow is the way that leads to life. That's what I mean by that. So just because somebody's rejected American evangelical Christianity doesn't mean that they've automatically become a follower of the way of Jesus. Of course not. I still think they need Jesus. I just don't think it's connected to some sort of spiritual plane of eternal torture if they reject him. I think you can live in the hell now that we've helped to create.
Who do you, I mean, for people that have come from that kind of world where Jesus, Christianity, God's, salvation, all these words are so loaded with years of kind of like indoctrination and seeing them a certain way.
Yeah, you just can't hear them again.
what are the paths that you would recommend? I know that you're a huge fan of Kierkegaard. And I know, to be honest with you, I see him as someone that very much largely was deconstructing and was a voice of, deconstructing the system of religion and his culture and saying, hey, this Christianity, not Christianity as far as I see, to the point where when he died, people were like, oh, was he saved? I don't think he was saved. And yet, if I remember rightly, they found like a note of his or something, or it was in his will where he was like, I'll now go to my love Jesus or something like that. And so everyone was kind of like, oh, he was saved or he did like Jesus. And so he was such a voice of contention for the church. And I have to confess, I've only read about half of your book. I did try and get it all done by this podcast, but I just have been crazy the last couple of weeks.
This is the biography I wrote of Kierkegaard. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And it's fantastic. Really, because I've read a few of different works trying to kind of lay out his stuff, and gosh, it's a mess out there. There's not much that's very easy to engage in. And
he's not easy. My book is intentionally meant to be for an educated lay person to enjoy the life and ideas of Kierkegaard. So,
well, I don't even know if I tick educated, but I'm loving it, and I'm like, oh, this is something I can get into. This is great.
He gave us the language for making the distinction between cultural Christianity, which he called Christendom, and authentic Christianity, which we would call following the way of Jesus. So that his language was authentic Christian or New Testament Christian versus Christendom. This was his language. I think he's very useful. He's totally in the water when it comes to modern ability to separate. Well, basically, he's aware of so Paul is marching around in the book of Acts, and he goes into a marketplace and says the name of Jesus. Nobody's ever heard that name before. So his mission field is a place where nobody has heard the name of Jesus. When I go into a marketplace and say the name of Jesus, everybody thinks I've stubbed my toe. So my mission field just happens to be a place where everybody has heard the name of Jesus, to the point where Jesus is now a commonplace oath that people will curse.
Yeah.
Or everybody. There's nobody I live in England. There is nobody in my country that has not heard the name of Jesus.
Yeah. And
that doesn't mean they know Jesus or know anything about Jesus, or it doesn't mean anything. It just means they've heard the name. So that's my mission field, as it were. This is my context. He's very useful for that, for thinking of Christendom and cultural inherited Christianity or Christian culture as the setting you're born into, just like you're born into Scottishness. You're born into Christianity now. And so we have to do a little bit of work to uncover whether Christianity is the same as Scottishness. And surprise, surprise, it's not. But we have to just do a little bit of work to unwean ourselves from the idea that being a Christian is part of being an inherited culture that you're born into.
Yeah.
And it isn't. And it doesn't come with the same responsibilities that being born Scottish does. It doesn't come with the same allegiances. But we've treated it as if it's a cultural identity for such a long time that it's very hard to imagine it as anything other. And that's Christendom. And Kierkegaard's very good for helping put a line between Christendom and authentic Christianity. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, apart from your book, which I highly recommend.
You're asking who else would
engage with? Well, no, I was wondering, who do you see as the prophets of today that are speaking to that group that are going, gosh, I'm so fed up with this kind of Christendom, this system that is just such a mess. But I don't even know how to redeem these things, because I've just not, and maybe they're not going to pick up. I don't want to throw anyone onto the table, because it might be actually the prophet that saves. I don't know. But certain people are just too, quote unquote, Christian for them to even engage with. Who do you see as the modern kind of philosopher, theologians, philosophers, whoever it might be, that you go, gosh, these people are speaking the right language. These people are going to reach those done with the church, but need to be kind of held on that narrow path of not letting go of Jesus, but kind of going, no, there's Jesus I want to hold on. Someone I think of maybe is someone like Brian Zand, I think does really well at kind of calling out one. And do you see like an emerging kind of group of people that you're like, gosh, these people are gonna be the people that save us?
There is a good handful of people. Like I said, this hasn't disappeared completely, and you tend to have to go into you don't have to, but the Anabaptist stream tends to have people who really pay attention to Jesus really well. I'm sure you know Anabaptism. Yeah. But so people like your Stanley Hauerwas is somebody who I rate quite highly. He's a Texan theologian, Hauerwas, a whole handful of vowels. Stanley Hauerwas just writes brilliantly, and if you want to get a book, War and the American Difference is a good one, where he talks about the core, the national identity and violence. And so Stanley will say, like, he'll teach his theology classes, and he'll say, we can't go anywhere until I convince you that nonviolence is the only legitimate Christian solution to anything. It's at the root of everything. And so he'll try and convince everybody about that first. But he's really good. You mentioned Brian Zand. Well, Brian Zand's best friend is Brad Jersak. I don't know if you know Brad Jersak.
Good. Yeah, I love Brad.
So Brad Jersak actually he's a regular guest on my podcast. So if people wanted to hear Brad, I don't know if you've ever talked to him, but
I've had him on a while back. I need to have him back on, I think.
He's such a gentle, kind guy. And he's not some angry, deconstructed, cynical evangelical. He was a vineyard pastor, and then he went through a time where the petrol ran out of that tank. He's an Orthodox. He's training to basically be an Orthodox priest or a reader in the Orthodox Church. He's really well read. He's gentle. He's kind. He's a really good example. I don't use the language of deconstruction for myself. I don't feel like that applies to me. But I'm not just looking for angry people. I'm looking for people who, I guess, ultimately, if they are willing to face and then reject nationalism, then I think, all right, I can start to hear your voice. So if I find some Christian writer who doesn't reject nationalism, I just think, that's the canary in the bottom of the mine shaft for me. It's kind of like, well, if you don't recognize that as a problem, your judgment is skewed. So I always go for the non-nationalists. So Brad Jersak is good. Brian Zand is good. Brian Zand lost a lot of his congregation when he stopped being patriotic, I'm looking on my bookshelves and stuff. I do enjoy, I'm trying to think I'm kind of a guy that likes older people. So I like Charles Williams, who was one of the Inklings, and he died in the 1940s. I like Kierkegaard. I like outsider thinkers. I've been influenced by Bonhoeffer. Karl Barth's Epistle to the Romans is all anti-religion. It's just this brilliant bombshell against religion. In the modern era, like people who are alive right now, I really like Sarah Coakley. She's a priest. Now, she's not going to be like this really sort of she's not a political theologian, but she writes some brilliant stuff about subversion and kenosis. So how kenosis, the act of withdrawing your will to make space for other wills, which is what Jesus does in Philippians 2, when he makes himself as nothing. It actually means he emptied his will to make space for other will. That she's really good, Sarah Coakley. I like her stuff.
Nice.
You can find some people, but I tend to be honest, I don't actually follow the whole like reconstructed alternative ex-evangelical crowd. I don't follow them at all. I tend to pay attention to people who have stood the test of time. So either have died and they are valuables now, or who are just voices, mature voices. They're not speaking out of an immediate reaction to something. Yeah.
Well, and this is just natural. So this is how we grow and develop, isn't it? But it does feel that the vast majority of people that come out of that world, that have been hurt, that have been betrayed, that have realized that the whole system is a bit of a joke, they do swing hard on the pendulum more often than not. Like it is the throwing the baby out with the bathwater and coming back for the baby. I think it is just part of natural progression of growth and development. Is you start to go, okay, hold on, let's look back, let's reintegrate some of this, let's figure out what kind of language and stuff. Sorry, which book was that you were showing?
Oh, I was going to say this guy, William Kavanaugh. It's a lot of men. I'm very aware of that anyway. But
well, if you're going back to people that are like back in the day, it's going to be even more men, right? I mean, that's just
I know that is that is the way it is. But William Kavanaugh has been very influential to me. He's a Roman Catholic American political theologian. When I use the word of like Christian imagination, or when I talk about our imagination's been colonized, I'm getting all that from William Kavanaugh. But his book, Migrations of the Holy, series of essays, he was one of Stanley Hauerwas's students. But it just such a good book, a fantastic analysis of how cultural Christianity, or how the state has captured the imagination of Christians. And so that stuff, I like that stuff. But I would say, I mean, if anybody really wanted real advice, to be frank, just get to know the Gospels, get to know the voice of Jesus, the actual voice of Jesus. So I don't care if you reject Christianity, like, good for you. Christianity is almost certainly fucking awful. I mean, it is rotten. Almost certainly whatever Christianity you were introduced to is, in lots of modern Western Christianity, has been constructed almost deliberately to avoid and get around Jesus. And Kierkegaard makes this point very clearly. He's like, a lot of Christianity is just an edifice designed to protect us from Jesus and to justify our disobedience to his way. So if you really want to reject Christianity, get to know the gospel really well. Get to know the voice of Jesus, and you'd be surprised. And you can read it. There's some really good, like Ched Myers. Have you ever read any Ched Myers?
No, I haven't. No.
A New Testament political theologian, New Testament scholar. He wrote a commentary on the Gospel of Mark called Binding the Strong Man. And it just brings out Jesus that you've never met. And yeah, it's rooted in genuine scholarship and he's not some hipster dude writing, making fun of evangelicals. He's a New Testament scholar. Another guy is Bob Ekblad. I don't know if you've ever heard of Bob Ekblad, but again, New Testament scholar, but also not a political moron. He works with illegal immigrants in America, and he's pro illegal immigrants. He's a radical, and he's a New Testament scholar. And you read these people's books, and you like, let them be your guide into the New Testament, where they aren't trying to defend and tub thump for Christianity. They just think this Jesus guy is much more interesting than you might have known. So I would almost say, get to know the voice of Jesus as you reject Christianity and see what happens. Yeah.
Well, this is something I found I found a lot of people, as they go through this process, trying to find the truth, trying to prove Christianity wrong, or whatever it is. And what's fascinating is, in the process of that, finding that some of the most militant voices of, the message of Christianity is warped and it's not what you believe or whatever, they actually frame. So I look at people like atheists and agnostics that are New Testament scholars. There's plenty of them out there. What's fascinating is how they see Jesus. You look at people that talk about the historical Jesus, and they strip away so much of the gospel as going, well, actually, probably not. That might not be authentic. Oh, that's not. And they go, well, what can we actually know? And what's fascinating is what they come out with is basically what you're putting forward. They go, gosh, this was this radical guy who was really trying to subvert the system of nationalism in this. Now, I'm not saying that's right. Buy that.
But I do think
it's fascinating.
I do think that the core Jesus that you get is actually also the divine character. So that's part of the package. And I don't say that from some faith point of view. What I mean is, for example, I mentioned Philippians 2, which is where it talks about Jesus did not consider equality with God a thing to be grasped, but instead he withdrew himself to make space for other selves. And then that hymn continues, and it says, and as a result, he was elevated, and all knees will bow and all the tongues will confess that Jesus Christ is Lord. So it's a hymn that has Jesus Christ who becomes God. Okay? Mm-hmm. Do you know that hymn is probably the earliest writing we have in the entire New Testament?
Yeah.
The Apostle Paul is the earliest writer we have. He was writing in the 40s and 50s. So Jesus was doing his thing in the 30s. Paul was writing in the 40s and 50s. And in the book of Philippians, he quotes a hymn that he did not write. So he is quoting back to the Philippians a hymn that they already knew, which was written well within living memory of Jesus.
Yeah.
This is not a church culture which has had many generations passing and they've added and accumulated on top of, oh, he was just a good man, and then they added all these supernatural elements. So
yeah,
you might not believe that Jesus was God, which is fine, fair enough, but the earliest people within living memory of him, they did think he was God.
Yeah.
So our actual like historical literary evidence doesn't prove that Jesus was God. All it proves is that people thought he was right from the start. Yeah. And not enough time has passed to accumulate to make some legend out of a man. Okay. Mm-hmm. So I do think part of the Jesus that you meet in the Gospels is somebody that was so startling that people were having their whole world. This is what, when it says, when people heard him speak, they were astonished at his teaching, says Mark. And the word is that same word you would use if there was an earthquake and you had to grab hold of the nearest pillar to hold you up, because your entire world was turned upside down. And this is the imagery that you get in the Gospels of the creator of the earth is here and he's reforming it in his image. And which is totally bizarre. And I can understand why, and I'm not going to convince Richard Dawkins or Sam Harris that this is, but I do think that's part of the inheritance we have in the Gospels.
Yeah.
Which even Christian churches don't understand or recognize, because they don't think that Jesus is God, by the way.
No.
So all these evangelical Christians who like to sing and to exclaim that Jesus is God, as soon as you say, they'll talk about violence, they'll go, yeah, we know Jesus said turn the other cheek, but what about the Nazis? What about blah, blah, blah? You can't run a country that way. So you're like, all right, so you don't actually think Jesus is God. You think Jesus is just a good teacher who offered something that you can now argue with.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Yeah. Or pit him against his father, because, well, what about this thing we have in the past that, well, God is also this. He's, Jesus is love, but God is also holy or just. And
which is a refusal to define God as the way Jesus did, right?
Yeah.
Which is to show you're not actually a Christian, or you're not thinking like a Christian.
Yeah, well, I mean, I often, when I used to travel and speak, I used to love doing this in churches because it made people so uncomfortable, and I love making people uncomfortable. That's a really dark side of me. But I'm not killing anyone, so I'm good. And I would go into church and I go, all right, everyone close your eyes. I want you to imagine this exercise with me. You're one of the Israelites and you've just gone to war with Canaan. God sent you in to, go to war, and you're fighting, and every man is just falling to your side and left and right, and all the Israelites, you're all winning everywhere. There's not one of you got a scratch on you. You've killed everyone. You go into town and you just get to pick out your new house, and so you go into this lovely big house, and it's beautiful, it's amazing. Your wife's going to be loving it. It's got enough rooms for all your kids, and you make your way upstairs and you go into the back room, and there's a young 14-year-old that's pregnant, and she's clutching a 3-year-old to her chest. What do you do?
Yeah.
And it's palpable, because everyone's like, shit, I know I'm going to have to kill this thing, right? They're trying to wrestle with the fact that they know how this story goes. I kill it. And I'm like, well, what do? You got to figure out. And so people are coming to terms with like, okay, so it's the way it works, how it works. And I'm like, okay, so Jesus walks in the room.
Yeah.
What do you do? And what's fascinating is for every person in the room, the story changes. Something changes. No longer is Jesus going, yeah, kill him, kill that person. But the God that commanded them to do that, he was going, yeah, this is good. He was like this militant. Yeah. And I think it just highlights just how far we've painted, and we pick and choose who we have as God in the circumstance. So when I'm reading my book in my quiet time and I'm praying, I'm maybe praying to Jesus, and maybe God looks a little bit more like Jesus because my God is kind of this loving, kind brother, But when I'm, justifying a war against Iraq, I'm maybe thinking of the guy that was going, go into Canaan and kill all the men, women, children.
Exactly.
And we kind of have this like fragmented. Michael Harden talks about like a Janus kind of faced God, this two-faced God, and we pick which side of the face, which we kind of turn the God around. Okay, Father this time, and then we turn it back around.
Phil, this is my point exactly. And so then, what's actually deciding which God we like is the one that's going to make our nation strong again or great again. That's what happens all the time. This is why, like, it always, and by nation I don't just mean your country. I mean like my people, the people I was born into, my tribe.
Yeah.
That's always the defining line. It's like, well, if it hurts my tribe, then I guess I'm going to read Deuteronomy, not the book of Matthew.
Yeah.
And
do you think it goes deeper?
Do not let Jesus change our imagination of what God is like. And we've inherited this ridiculous view of the Bible as if it's some magic book that fell from the sky, and that the book of Deuteronomy is absolutely equal to the Gospel of Mark. And it's the Gospel of Mark is setting itself out. Sometimes explicitly, the Gospels explicitly set themselves up to want you to reread and reimagine your Hebrew scriptures. Yeah. And yet we don't. We go, oh, this is interesting. It says here in Mark, you should love your enemies, but it says here in Joshua that you should dash babies on the ground. I guess we'll go with Joshua this time.
Yeah.
It's evil and insane. And it's just it just makes a nonsense of any idea that Jesus might be the word of God and not Joshua. Yeah.
Wow. No, it's really good.
So I think a lot of Christians just aren't deep. So then when you say that to a Christian church, then they get all upset because you're challenging not the divinity of Jesus. In fact, you have such a high view of the divinity of Jesus that you're willing, shock horror, to not think that the book of Joshua is literally true for you today.
Yeah.
Imagine that.
He demands we reimagine God.
Yeah.
I mean, there's no way to read the Gospels and not see that people were getting pissed off with Jesus, saying, you think God's like this, but my Father, God, is not. He looks like me. And people were actively pissed off at him before it, and I think if we're not having that response to whoever we're reading throughout the Old Testament going, okay, I need to reevaluate that based on what Jesus said. If you're not having that response every time you read, and then God said do this or God did that, if you're not going, okay, does that line up with what Jesus said? Yeah. You're not taking that seriously, exactly. At least from my perspective,
And you can see why Jesus was so hated and what they need to kill him. I mean, you really don't try and kill somebody who says, wouldn't it be nice if we all were nice to each other? That is not why you try and kill somebody. You kill somebody when they say, follow me, I'm doing something new, and it's credible, and you have thousands of people swarming over the hillsides to be with you.
Yeah. And
the powers that be look at that and go, we are losing all of our power, which is exactly what the Gospels tell us. This is what they say. The whole world is going over to him. So, and then you get some impression of, well, that same happens today. If you say these things in a Christian church today, everybody will be mad at you. So you get some idea of the kind of anger that Jesus might have arisen in his nationalist religious culture.
Yeah. So what do you think? I mean, we need to wrap up and wind down, but I'm intrigued from the political side of this. I mean, and it's all politics and it's all theology and it's all at some level philosophy. It's all intermingles. But I look at something like, a lot of the audience listening to this are going to be American. They're facing an election right now. I'm not sure. I think this might be out by then. But, they're about to make a decision, or you can make them regret whatever decision they've already made. You look at something like that, and you look at like, oh, you've got to vote Democrat or Republican, right? There's no other option on the table really apart from a quote-unquote wasted vote, whatever people think about that, There's an element of when we divorce from this nationalism, or even on a more subtle sentence, because a lot of people go, well, I'm not that nationalistic, you don't really understand. Like, just an us-them mentality, this me versus us versus them.
And my side, I guess, look, I don't think like your average progressive Christian, like their problem is probably not going to be some sort of temptation to nationalist jingoism. All right, fine.
Yeah.
But would a progressive Christian, are they really into making sure that the people who look like them and sound like them control the narrative? Are they really addicted to dominating the spaces they're in, the intellectual or linguistic spaces, right? It's when you find people who cannot bear to let other people be wrong. Now you're finding an anti-Christ-like mentality. Like, it's that impulse which I see in any tribal group, which is like, it's got to be, our group has to be the loudest voice in the room.
Yeah.
We need to dominate the space. Our egos need to fill the space. Other voices need to be silenced. Get with the program. I don't see right now, obviously the conservatives have a pretty strong stranglehold on their dominance being used with Christian language. But I think we can recognize that that temptation or that possibility is completely there with the progressive side as well.
Yeah.
So
it's more subtle in a sense, in that it's like you look at the conservative. Well, obviously, here we go: nationalism, patriotism. You know, it's linked to this like heightened religion. Yeah. But there's a subtle kind of. I hate all these kind of terms and languages, but this kind of virtue signaling of like, oh, I'm above that, I'm beyond that. Look at me, I'm not nationalist. I'm not. But then there's still a thing of like, well, yeah, but I want my way or the highway. I still want my group to have its way, and in some ways it's like that's not necessarily even on a practical day-to-day level. I'm not saying that's an evil thing. It's a good thing to vote for someone that does want if your way is to have all included, yes, I think that's a really good idea to vote for someone like you. It's a great idea. But
our politics is way more than our voting, right? I mean, this is part of what William Kavanagh would say is your political imagination has been captured by the state as well, so that you think we all think that voting every 4 years, or if we're in the UK every 5 years, is our political identity. Your politics is way more than who you vote for every 4 years. In fact, who you vote for every 4 years is one of the least important political things you can do. And it is certainly one of the least effective political things you can do. But how you use your voice, how you use your power, what do you do when you're in the presence of somebody who's with different power than you, how you use your money, how you use your resources, these are all political actions. And you could be highly political even if you never voted. Yeah. So I don't like the idea that voting is the only it's now dominated the entire political imagination. Yeah. What partisan team are you on? And it's like, well, the partisan stuff itself is part of the corruption of politics, to be frank. Yeah. So I do have sympathy for people who don't vote, to be honest. Although Donald Trump is so bad that you just need to get rid of him. That is true, but it's not going to fix the problem. Like if Donald Trump loses, that's still not going to fix all the problems. That's not going to solve such partisanship. A bizarre
system anyway, in that this person that's in charge isn't making all the decisions. They have to run through a whole system of people, and then you go, oh wow, these people are in power, and then you look for a bit further and go, oh, these people are, and it filters down, doesn't it? Where you go, oh gosh, we actually have a lot of power to change things. Maybe, I don't know, hopefully. Or you go, well, businesses are buying them out. I'm like, well, stop giving these businesses your money. I don't know, if Google are buying a politician, use DuckDuckGo or something, I don't know, or buy an Apple instead of an Android. I don't know if there's a good option to buy. I don't know
it's a political decision about what you do with social media or how you spend your money on Amazon or the local, if you buy locally rather than through Amazon. You got to recognize, just expand your imagination to realize, oh yeah, that's also political, because it has to do with society, it has to do with organized sociality, it has to do with institutions. Which institutions are you going to want to see flourish, and which ones do you want to see wither a little bit more? These are all political things. Even if you're not talking about right or left or red or blue, you are talking about our vision for society and how society works. And I think that gospel New Testament type things have a lot to say in that world. Yeah. But a lot of Christians don't think that. They just think, well, it means every 4 years you vote red, so the blue team doesn't win. And their political imagination is withered on the vine. And I would love to see the followers of Jesus start to really think of themselves as an alternative kingdom amongst the kingdoms. Yeah. Not as some place you go to when you die. But as right now, the way we use our money and resources and use our power, it's right now is a political act. And that's the kinds of things I'm working for. Without trying to dominate spaces and argue people. And it's hard to do.
Yeah, well, at the end of the day, we all want our us and thems. We all want those lines where we feel we belong. We feel we're part of something. Exactly. We feel it's a very natural human condition. And again, that's why this is not practical, or it's confounding the wisdom of the world, or any of these kind of different terms that we might use.
I mean, one thing I definitely don't believe is this false equivalent. I don't like false equivalent. I hope that nobody hears me say, oh, well, all sides are equally bad. They're not equally bad, because one side wastes and abuses human life, is greedy, is motivated by violence and patriotism and dishonesty, and might is right. The other side is motivated by violence and dishonesty, and might is right, and they're violent and greedy and bad, and they do it in the name of Jesus. So tell me, which side is worse?
Yeah.
I do think that the absolute stranglehold right now that cultural Christianity and right-wing nationalist politics has in the UK and in America, certainly in America, like, I do think it's a lot worse. There's nothing equivalent to the left wing right now.
No.
For all that the lefties have their problems, and of course they do, at least one of those problems is not a lock tight hold on the name of Jesus as a baptizing for their politics. At least that's not one of their problems, So, and at least progressives aren't actively trying to kill their enemies, which that's what patriotic military spending and all that is. So I don't believe in false equivalence. I do think the stranglehold of conservatism on Christianity is worse right now. And I can easily imagine in a generation if the progressives finally get their people in power, and I can imagine that becoming a problem. But come and let's have this conversation in a generation when the name of Jesus is associated with progressive domination over the space.
Well, it feels like a bit like at the beginning you mentioned the give Caesar his taxes. The early church was going, well, yeah, but like, what are we going to do with money? Not pay our taxes? Like, that's not going to work. Just give the money to Caesar, move on, and let's change the world. And I feel like there's concessions to be made in the whole thing where you go, okay, well, I've got to vote one way or the other. One, left, right, here we go. Now, okay, both are corrupt systems, both are lost to power, both are this, both are that. But you know what? In the marginal differences, a lot of people are dying. A lot of people are lost. A lot of people are hurt. So let me vote and go, that marginal difference means something. Even if it doesn't mean something to me, and even if it doesn't change based on my ethics, it actually could mean a very significant change in someone else's life. And I think that's where you got to work with what you got. Yeah, would we prefer a better system? Yeah, would we prefer, ranked voting, or which is the power are never going to give ranked voting to people. But would it be nice?
Okay, if you really want to follow the way of Jesus, if you really do call yourself a Christian or something, well, okay, Jesus didn't talk about voting systems. He didn't talk about local versus federal spending. He didn't talk about abortion. He didn't talk about taxation very much. I mean, he did, but he didn't talk about the nitty gritty of it. He did, however, say, don't take the name of your Lord in vain.
Yeah.
So which politicians right now, which groups are taking the name of the Lord in vain? Oh, maybe that's a clue. We don't actually allow the concerns of Jesus to influence our political concerns. Yeah. We are so much more interested in having our narrative be the dominant one in the space that we forget that that's actually the opposite of anything Jesus said. Don't do these things in my name. Yeah. Anyway.
That's huge. That is a monumental piece to finish on. I'll maybe try and bump this up so it comes out before the election. But yeah, I'll maybe shuffle things around.
Well, go and vote, please. If you're American, please vote. Please don't vote for the person who takes the groups that take the name of the Lord in vain. But also don't worship your own voting, and don't think that it's gonna. If the blue team wins, that is not going to solve your problems, and if the red team wins, that is not the end of the world. We got more things going on.
Well, don't outsource. You're walking in the path of Christ.
Don't outsource it to some politician.
Vote for someone else that will. If someone else is walking it out, give them power too. Great, and then go do it yourself. Right? I mean, that's got to be the thing. It's got to be where we're at. Stephen, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Anyway, thank you very much.
I really appreciate it. For people that want to track with you, you're on social media, you've got your podcasts. How can people connect with you?
Well, I'll make sure social media, not really. It makes my heart sad to argue on social media with anybody. Check out Tent Theology podcast. Just Tent Theology. Easy to find wherever you buy podcasts. I promise if you don't like it, I'll give you your money back. Ha ha ha. And that's the way I do it. It's Tent Theology podcast. And then my website is Tent Theology as well. You can find all sorts of places.
Is that
other places I've spoken there. Yeah, .com.
Awesome.
easy to find. And I'm on
awesome.
Amazon and stuff. But I'd rather you buy, if you're going to buy my books, please do it through a local bookshop. Please order through a local bookshop if you want to buy my books.
That's great. I love it. Wonderful. Well, thank you very much, Stephen. We'll maybe have you on another point and dive into some other bits and pieces. I feel there's a lot of areas we could have gone, and you are clearly someone that knows a lot about a lot of different things that you're a lot better read than me, and I like outsourcing my reading. So.
Well, it's nice to finally meet with you. We've been bouncing in and out of each other's inboxes for a long time.
I know. So many close friends have said you need to connect with Stephen, and I just, it's this world we live in is crazy. That's for sure. And
brilliant.
Yeah. It's taken a pandemic for us to be able to connect.
Wow.
But no, it's great to meet.
Jesus bless you and your listeners then.
Yeah, thank you, man. Have a good one, yeah?
Okay, bye.
All right, love you, man. Bye.